It was a cold Wednesday afternoon, and I recall it as if it were yesterday. My kitchen sink had been giving me trouble for weeks. The leak had started as a small, occasional drip, but it soon worsened. Unsure of how else to handle it, I finally decided to call a plumber. His name was Alex. Though I hadn't met him before, I'd heard he was quite skilled, so I assumed it would be a simple fix. When he arrived, I opened the door and was taken by surprise. He was much younger than I'd expected, likely in his late 30s or early 40s, and attractive too. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a strong build. I welcomed him inside and led him into the kitchen where the leak was. To be honest, I'd put on a nice robe that morning. It wasn't anything too revealing, just something light and comfortable. But when I caught Alex glancing at me, even briefly, I felt a small thrill. As Alex knelt to work under the sink, I found myself lingering close by, simply watching him. I didn't quite know why, but there was something about him. Perhaps it was his calm confidence, or maybe it was simply that I hadn't had much company lately. Whatever the reason, I felt a warmth building within me. I started a conversation, asking him about his day, how long he'd been working as a plumber, things like that. He was polite, answering my questions without looking up too much, but I noticed a slight nervousness in his voice, as though he were focusing more on the task than on me. I found it endearing, and a smile played on my lips. At one point, I reached out and gently touched his shoulder, giving it a light squeeze. It was innocent enough, but I felt him stiffen beneath my hand. "You're pretty strong," I said, complimenting him, though I sensed he was slightly on edge. He glanced up at me, surprised, and I returned his look with a soft smile. He shifted his weight, trying to put some distance between us, but I wasn't quite ready to let him go. I stepped a bit closer, pretending to be curious about his work. "Do you need any help?" I asked, knowing full well he didn't. I adjusted my robe slightly, letting it slip off my shoulder just a bit. Alex didn't say anything, but I noticed his cheeks redden as he concentrated on the pipes under the sink. I leaned down next to him, and as I did, my hand brushed his arm. He tensed again, yet I didn't pull back. There was a spark between us, something electric, and I was certain he felt it too. I straightened up slowly, moving even closer. He remained crouched under the sink, doing his best to ignore the tension growing between us, but I wasn't planning to let it slide that easily. I waited until he stood up to gather his tools, and that's when I made my move. I leaned in, close enough for him to feel my breath against his neck. "Is there anything else you could help me with?" I asked, my voice soft but with a hint of suggestion. He looked at me, his eyes wide, but he didn't respond immediately. I could see him wrestling with how to react, so I gave him a gentle nudge, literally. My hand slid down his arm, a slight touch to make it clear where this could go. Then, without waiting for him to answer, I leaned in and kissed him lightly on the cheek. It wasn't a bold move at first, just a soft, gentle kiss, but I felt him freeze, realizing I'd crossed a line. He quickly stood, nearly bumping into the cabinets, his eyes showing a hint of panic. "Ma'am, I'm just here to fix the sink," he stammered, his voice trembling slightly. I couldn't help but chuckle softly. "Are you sure there's nothing else that needs fixing?" I teased, stepping a little closer, so my lips were only inches from his. I could see him struggling, unsure whether to stay or leave. His hands shook slightly as he tried to pack his tools. "There's something else you could take care of for me," I whispered, leaning in, as though I were about to kiss him again. But before I could, he took a step back, holding his hands up as though to ward me off. "I can't," he said, shaking his head. "I really can't." I pouted, feeling slightly disappointed, but I knew he wasn't going to give in. Flustered, he finished packing up his things. I watched him go, feeling a rush from the entire exchange. I hadn't expected him to go that far, but it was exciting to push his buttons. Maybe next time, though, who knew? As he left, there was something in the air beyond just awkwardness. There was a tension, a lingering feeling, and I knew that although Alex had said no, it wasn't due to a lack of interest. It felt like he was holding back, trying to do the right thing while struggling against his impulses. I could see it in his eyes, the way he paused before leaving, as if he wanted to stay, but wasn't sure he could trust himself. Days passed, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Each time I walked by the sink, I remembered how flustered he'd been when I touched his arm, the shift in his breathing when I kissed him on the cheek. It was exhilarating, something I hadn't felt with anyone in a long time, especially with someone younger. Truthfully, I didn't expect to see him again. I figured he'd decided not to come back after what happened, but about a week later, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but when I picked up, it was Alex. "Hey, this is Alex, the plumber. I just wanted to check if everything's all right with the sink. Did the repair hold up?" His tone was professional, yet I caught a slight tremor in his voice. I smiled to myself. "Oh, Alex, how thoughtful of you to check," I replied, keeping my voice casual, though I knew exactly where this might go. "Funny you should ask. The sink is fine, but there's an issue in the bathroom I was hoping you could look at. It's probably nothing major, but I'd feel better if a professional took a look." There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear him weighing his options, considering if he should come back. "I can be there in about an hour," he replied finally. When I hung up, I felt a thrill of anticipation. This time, things would be different. I didn't plan to let him off so easily. I knew he felt something, even if he tried to deny it, and I was determined to push things a bit further. When Alex arrived, he seemed noticeably more nervous than he had the first time. His usual confident demeanor was still there, but I could sense the hesitation. As he stepped inside the bathroom, "Huh?" he murmured, glancing around as if he was trying to keep his focus away from me. I guided him upstairs, where, sure enough, there was a minor problem with the faucet. It wasn't leaking, but the handle had loosened. He knelt down to examine it, his concentration locked on the task this time, though I sensed he was more aware of me than before. I stood just behind him, watching as he worked, saying nothing at first. The silence between us was heavy, filled with unspoken tension. Finally, I couldn't hold back anymore. "Alex," I said softly. He paused for a moment, his hand gripping the faucet a bit tighter. "Yes?" His voice was cautious, as if he wasn't sure whether to acknowledge what had happened between us last time. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about our last encounter," I continued, stepping closer. "You seemed interested, but you held back. Why?" He didn't answer immediately, but I noticed his knuckles whitening as he continued with the faucet. "It's just, I'm a professional," he finally replied, his voice barely audible. "Who decides what's right or wrong, Alex?" I asked, moving even closer so I could feel the warmth radiating from him. "You're a grown man, and I'm a grown woman. We both know there's something here, a connection between us. You can feel it, can't you?" I studied him closely, watching for his reaction. His breathing had quickened, and his hands shook slightly as he finished tightening the faucet. He stood up, facing me, and I could see the struggle in his eyes. He was clearly trying to maintain a professional demeanor, to keep some distance between us, but it was obvious he was finding me not touching him affection. "You don't have to resist," I whispered, stepping even closer and letting my hand graze his chest. I could feel his heart racing beneath my fingers. "No one has to know," I added, my voice soft but firm. "It's just us here." He looked down at me, his jaw clenched, and for a second, I thought he might actually walk away again. But then, without warning, he reached out and took my arm, pulling me toward him. His grip was firm, but not harsh, and the suddenness of the move surprised me. His face was now mere inches from mine, his breath warm on my skin. "Margaret," he said, his voice low and intense, "this isn't a game." "I never said it was," I replied, a smile tugging at my lips. The tension between us felt like electricity crackling in the air. "But it doesn't have to be complicated either. Sometimes you just have to let go." He hesitated just a moment longer, but then, without another word, he leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't the hesitant peck on the cheek from before. This was different. It was deep, passionate, as if all the restraint he'd been holding onto had finally broken. I kissed him back, my arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer. For a few moments, the world around us faded, leaving only Alex, his hands on my waist, his lips on mine, and the heat that had been building between us for days. When we eventually pulled apart, both of us were breathing heavily, and I saw in his eyes that there was no turning back now. "What now?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I smiled and, stepping back just slightly to give him a little space, but not too much. "I think you know the answer to that, Alex. We've already crossed the line. Why stop now? We're at 9,968th. He didn't respond verbally. He didn't need to. With one last glance at the door, he reached for me again, and this time there was no hesitation, no second guessing. This time, we were both fully committed, and neither of us intended to turn back. And let's just say, that afternoon, the bathroom wasn't the only thing that got fixed. It had been ages since I felt this way. The moment Alex kissed me, All the tension and unspoken longing between us erupted into something neither of us could hold back. He pulled me close, his hands tracing the contours of my back as his lips pressed against mine, now bolder, more intense. I could feel the weight of everything he'd been suppressing. We didn't even make it out of the bathroom at first. He pushed me gently against the wall, his hands roaming over my shoulders, my waist, my hips. His touch was firm but still careful, like he was letting himself lose control while still holding back from going too far. But I didn't mind. I didn't want him to hold back. I wanted this as much as he did. His lips moved from my mouth to my neck, and I let out a soft gasp. He paused, as if checking to make sure I was okay with everything. When I didn't stop him, he continued, his kisses growing more urgent, more desperate. It was as though all the time he'd spent holding back had built up into something neither of us could resist. But eventually, we had to pause, if only to catch our breath. We stayed pressed together, both of us panting, as though we'd run a marathon. His forehead rested against mine, and for a moment we stood in silence, taking in what had just happened. "I've never done anything like this," Alex murmured, his voice low and husky. "Oh, I shouldn't have." I placed my hand on his chest, feeling his heart racing beneath his shirt. "There's nothing wrong with letting go once in a while, Alex. We're adults. We can do what we want." I smiled softly, hoping to ease the guilt I saw creeping into his expression. He let out a small, nervous laugh. "You make it sound so simple," he said. "It is simple," I insisted, stepping back slightly, though I kept my hand on him. "You've been holding back. Why? Because of some invisible line between what's right and what's wrong? Sometimes you just have to follow what feels good." He didn't say anything right away, just looked at me with an intense, unreadable expression. Finally, he let out a long breath, as if releasing all the tension he'd been carrying. "I guess I needed to hear that," he admitted. The rest of the afternoon was a blur. After we'd both calmed down, I led him downstairs, and we settled in the living room, talking in a way we hadn't before. The conversation wasn't forced or awkward as I'd feared it might be. Instead, we laughed, shared stories, and learned more about each other. Alex opened up about his life, sharing how he'd been a plumber for nearly a decade after leaving a corporate job he'd despised. He talked about how the steady work of fixing things had become a comfort for him. He shared how plumbing had become something he could rely on, a routine he could control. In a way, it made sense. He seemed like the type of man who needed that kind of order, that steady foundation. I told him about my own life too, about my marriage and how it had ended years ago, leaving me on my own, but not resentful. I wasn't someone who held onto regrets. I'd lived a good life, but there had been something missing for a long time. Companionship, passion. I wasn't seeking anything serious, but I did need to feel alive again, and Alex had brought that feeling back, even if only for an afternoon. As the day started to fade, we sat together on the couch, the late afternoon sunlight warming the room. I realized he had been here much longer than he'd originally planned. "You probably should get going," I said, though part of me wished he could stay a little longer. He hesitated, looking like he didn't want to leave just yet. Yeah, I suppose I should, but I don't want this to end on a this strange note. I don't want you to feel like I I was just I shook my head, smiling warmly at him. I don't, Alex. You're a good man. We both needed this, and I'm glad it happened. But I'm not expecting anything more than what it was. He seemed relieved, though there was a hint of uncertainty in his eyes, as if he wasn't used to things being so simple. So, you are really okay with everything? No strange feelings or anything? He asked. I laughed softly. No, Alex, no weird feelings. It was just a moment we both enjoyed. No strings, no pressure. He nodded slowly, as if trying to wrap his head around the simplicity of it all. All right, he said, after a pause. I guess I'll see you around. Maybe, I replied playfully, if my sink breaks again, you'll be the first one I call. He smiled, picking up his tools and slinging his bag over his shoulder. But before he stepped out, he turned back to look at me one last time. Margaret, I don't regret it. I want you to know that. I don't either, I replied softly, watching as he opened the door, and then he was gone. I sat there for a while after he left, reflecting on everything that had happened. It was one of those rare moments where everything aligned perfectly. No guilt, no shame, just two people letting down their guard for a little while. In the days that followed, I found myself thinking about him now and then, but I knew what we had shared was a one-time experience, a brief escape, and that was all right. Sometimes that's all you really need. I wondered if he thought of me too, but I didn't reach out. I didn't have to. That afternoon had been precisely what it was meant to be, a reminder that I was still alive, still capable of feeling excitement, desire, and spontaneity. And as for Alex, I hoped he felt the same. Sometimes, all it takes is one unexpected connection to remind you that life doesn't have to stay confined within safe boundaries. Perhaps he returned to his routine, fixing pipes and going through his days as he always had. Or maybe, just maybe, that afternoon had given him a little something extra. A fresh outlook, a reminder of the importance of letting go when the moment felt right. Whatever happened, I knew I wouldn't forget him. Who knows? Maybe the next time something breaks around here, I'll call him. Or maybe I'll let fate decide. But for now, I'll treasure that little adventure for exactly what it was. Something unexpected, something beautiful, and something that reminded me, even at 64, that life still holds surprises.